Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the conventions and codes of popular science writing so we can better approach and understand the kinds of techniques and methodologies that are being employed in the article that you have to read for our next interactive class on Wednesday, Stripped for Parts by Jennifer Kahn. As we go through this list and I read off certain segments of a document that is an adaptation from a book about popular science writing or popular science journalism, keep in mind the techniques that you've seen if you've already begun to read the article. Think about how you can apply these techniques or you can interpret these techniques as they are being used in that work. A text like Stripped for Parts is as much a piece of entertainment media because you have to convince a reader or a prospective purchaser to actually pick up your magazine off of a rack or to subscribe to your magazine because they are looking to be entertained, as it is something that is designed to educate and to inform. As a result, one of the principal objectives of any media text is to catch the reader, to entertain the reader, to solicit their readership. That's as much true for a work of science journalism like Stripped for Parts as it is for any of the stories that we'll be reading in the course of this semester, whether it be H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau or Jessica Grant's Come Thou Tortoise. So one of the most crucial things to remember is that the intended reader is not an expert. The tone and the level of discourse that is presented in the text that you are reading has to be adapted to your intended audience. So if you use technical terminology, as this work does, it has to be presented in the form of allegories or metaphors. Examples have to be provided and broken down such that technical jargon does not obfuscate the intended meaning of the text and the actual science that undergirds it. Because of your professional training, you would obviously be more familiar with many of the concepts that are being explored in this article than a layperson. However, this article has to be tailored to meet the needs, the intellectual knowledge, the understanding of a reader who is not educated in these subjects. One of the important things to do in any story, and in large part, even an article is a story. There's a narrative component to it. We respond better to stories than we do to rote recitations of facts and details. Couching this entire experience in the form of a narrative, as we'll discuss, of Jennifer Kahn's experience with organ harvesting over a single evening, allows the reader to enter into the narrative, to appreciate and to absorb the technical information more easily. So many of the techniques that we see in the attempt to catch the reader are oriented around the creation of this sense of engagement. Some of the things that can be done in order to generate that engagement or to catch the reader's attention would be to ensure that there is an attractive or interesting title, perhaps one that poses a question or that fascinates the reader. The introduction to the essay also has to, or the journal article as the case may be, has to catch the reader's attention. A critic of H.P. Lovecraft, Michel Houellebecq, once said that H.P. Lovecraft, an author of short stories primarily, assaults the story like a radiant suicide. In other words, in those first few sentences, Lovecraft presents to us some fantastical image or mystery, something that is so shocking and fascinating that we are compelled to continue to read. It is this radiant suicide, which is a fascinating and disturbing term that we could unpack, but that's not the point. The point is that the first few lines, the first paragraph of a story or of an article has to grab the reader and draw them in. So there's a number of techniques, or there are a number of techniques employed in that introduction in terms of the image that it presents, the questions that it poses, or the concepts that it explores that are designed to just yoke the reader and hook them into reading the rest of it. This introduction should also make clear the relevance or the significance of the study or of the information being presented. Do you present a human element, something that's relevant to their lives or that is applicable to their experiences, that then causes them to want to read the rest of this article and see how the science inside of it is actually germane or relevant to them and their condition? Some of the techniques that can be used to create this kind of approach. The popular science article has various parts that are integrated such that the author is attempting to best communicate the message. That is, the task is to make the contents of the article understandable and interesting to a layperson. We're going to take a look at a variety of different techniques here that the author of a popular science journal article like Jennifer Kahn can use to create this sense of interest and engagement, and we'll be applying some of these techniques and exploring them in the article itself. One of the common ways to create this sense of engagement is by making the subject interesting by way of stylistic devices, using elaborate, innovative imagery and metaphors to catch the reader's attention. These stylistic devices and rhetorical devices are oftentimes used to add spice or life to what could otherwise be dull information. The information itself should be conveyed in concrete examples, and we of course see that in Jennifer Kahn's article. She makes fantastic use of this approach by grounding the entire story of the science, well, inside of a story. The science becomes something that is peppered within all of this unfolding narrative of her personal experience in that one night in the room of a dead man. You move from the abstract to the concrete. You move from the science to the human element because it is a specific example. So an illustration of that would be the evolution of the eye as an example of Darwinian theory of evolution. Other stylistic devices could include metaphors that help the reader to associate complex and perhaps esoteric science with comprehensible everyday experiences. So examples of that would be something like the rainforests are the lungs of the earth, or cyanobacteria work like hydrogen factories. It's taking scientific or subject area specific terms and then grounding them in people's experiences and concepts that they're already familiar with. Authors of these texts will also often let the reader perform a thought experiment where different premises are given. In such a case, the author can speculate freely without bothering about the actual limitations involved. So imagine there's no oxygen in the atmosphere, or if we could travel through time. In other words, you're taking these scientific concepts, but you're placing it in a speculative framework that allows or that primes the reader to respond with his or her imagination and become involved in the process of writing this article and imagining it. Narrative, dialogue, and personification are all means of essentially humanizing the science again. By framing this dry material in the form of a conversation, we are naturally drawn into it because suddenly you almost have character or humanity to the piece. And the same is true with the inclusion of dialogue within a text. Take a look at this work and look for those moments or examine those moments where dialogue, narration, and personification are being used, and you may see how they draw us into the experience. Other techniques or aspects of a text, a nonfiction text like this that can draw in readers, would be an interesting, engaging title, something that perhaps that sparks questions or fries the imagination. Now, in the context of that title, you may want to consider, or an author of a popular science journal article may want to consider, using such things as metaphor. So, membrane proteins, the St. Peter of the cells. So St. Peter is said to essentially stand at the gateway to heaven and allow people entrance or to deny it to them. So here, membrane proteins suddenly are connected to this metaphor of St. Peter being the gatekeeper of heaven, membrane proteins being the gatekeepers of the cells. Quotations and proverbs. Well-known quotations and proverbs express something that we all recognize as true, or that is generally colloquially perceived to be true. They therefore create a link to concepts that are already familiar to the reader, because one of the major objectives of any journalistic text is to bring the reader in, to guide the reader into complex concepts that they might not be familiar with, to ease them into an understanding of, in this case, the science behind whatever subject is being addressed. Birds of a feather, do they always flock together, as an example. Allusions based on particular cultural background information can also help to draw the reader in. Remember, all of this is about making experiences comprehensible and easy for readers to grapple with. Rhyme and alliteration as a kind of technique to generate amusement and foster readership. Questions that are being posed, threat and danger, and both of these walk in hand. If you have your reader concerned about something, or if you have them desiring the answer to a question that you have raised either in your title or very early on in your piece, suddenly the person is invested. They're looking for the conclusion, they're looking for the solution. And lastly, The introduction to an article is just as important as the conclusion. If you have, as Desdemona puts it in Shakespeare's play Othello, a most lame and impotent conclusion, then everything that has preceded it will fall flat. They won't remember it. All that the reader will walk away with from that article is probably the disappointment that they felt from that conclusion that failed to cap off the entire experience. It's much the same as an essay. In an essay, without a robust and meaningful conclusion, suddenly everything that you've done seems to fall flat. It's like a gymnast who has executed a perfect performance and then breaks her leg on the landing. It doesn't matter how good everything else was up until that point. That broken leg is the only thing that she cares about, and the judges are probably going to care about. So the conclusion has to be as robust, as meaningful, and as impactful as everything that came before it. An article with no clear conclusion might sound as if it can just pass by unnoticed. Some kind of punch, kick, or strong resolution has to be offered. Oftentimes, in an article, just like in an essay, a good way to conclude is to look ahead and tell the reader what issues remain to be answered. If there's something that hasn't been addressed or that remains an outstanding issue or problem or subject of consideration. You can also speculate on the implications that your findings might have, or you can state what you've learned and what experiences you've gained yourself. Now, everything up until that last point is identical for an essay. When you write that transition to openness in an essay, you're posing a question, or better yet, you're illustrating what questions remain and how they might be answered. What could you look at in another essay, or what remains to be resolved? Or how are the ideas in this essay or in this piece that you presented relevant to the issues that human beings actually face in their daily lives? How does this apply to a contemporary world or a modern situation? All of these techniques and approaches, these aspects of journalistic writing, are things that you should keep in mind as we go ahead and start to consider Stripped for Parts by Jennifer Kahn in our interactive class on Wednesday.